The airport was bustling with the usual crowd, families rushing to catch flights, business travelers glued to their phones, children running around, and the constant hum of voices. But for Colonel Jack Thompson, today was different. He strode through the terminal, his polished boots clicking on the floor, his uniform a symbol of service and sacrifice. But the weight on his chest wasn't from the medals pinned to his chest. It was from the casket being loaded onto the plane, draped in the American flag. Private First Class Alex Parker, a young soldier, had been taken from his family too soon. Only 22 years old, he had paid the ultimate price. Thompson adjusted his cap and took a deep breath. Today he wasn't just a soldier, he was a man on a mission, a promise made long ago. As he approached the airline counter, he presented his military orders and ID. The agent at the desk barely glanced at him, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she typed. Then she paused, just for a moment, but it was long enough for Thompson to feel the shift in the air. "Sir, can I see that again?" she asked, her voice a little too tight. Thompson handed her the documents again, watching as she exchanged a glance with another staff member. Something was off. He could feel it. The agent hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket. We're unable to process your flight at the moment." Colonel Thompson's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier," he said, his voice steady. "Everything is in order. The paperwork is correct." The agent blinked, looking around nervously. "I understand, sir, but there's a security protocol we need to follow. I'm afraid I can't make exceptions." Colonel Thompson exhaled slowly, feeling the tension rising in the air around him. "Security protocol?" he repeated, his voice calm but firm. "This is a military assignment. My orders are valid." He didn't back down, didn't flinch as the line behind him began to grow. People were starting to notice. The murmurs spread, quiet at first but growing louder. His stance was firm. He wasn't leaving without an answer. The agent turned to consult with a colleague, speaking in low tones, and Colonel Thompson could tell they were trying to figure out how to handle the situation. The moment stretched on, thick with uncertainty. Finally, a supervisor appeared. He was in his mid-50s, with a weary expression and a professional demeanor. He adjusted his tie and approached Thompson, giving him a practiced, tight smile. "Colonel, I apologize for the inconvenience," the supervisor said, his voice heavy with politeness, but his eyes darted quickly to the agent behind the counter. "There's a policy in place. We can't make exceptions." "Policy?" Colonel Thompson's voice was even, but the weight of his words hung in the air. "What exactly is this policy?" "My orders are in order. I'm on a military mission, not a personal trip." The agent looked uncomfortable, her fingers trembling as she typed into the system again. The supervisor shifted on his feet, clearly not wanting to escalate the situation further. The tension in the air was palpable. Colonel Thompson's gaze remained steady, unwavering as the passengers in line began to whisper, their eyes on him. He knew they were watching, waiting to see if he would back down. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. It wasn't about him. It was about Private First Class Jason Reynolds, the young soldier who was now waiting for the journey home. The mission was his responsibility, and he wouldn't let anyone stand in his way. The line behind him was growing longer, murmurs turning into conversations. A few people started pulling out their phones, and within moments, the first video began to be recorded. Just as Colonel Thompson began to think the situation might start to resolve itself, a voice rang out from behind him. "Excuse me, sir, but is there a problem?" The voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority. He turned slightly to see a man, an older gentleman in a military cap, standing a few feet away, watching the situation unfold. The man stepped forward, his presence commanding. "I've seen things like this before," the older man said, his voice firm, "but I've never seen a soldier be treated this way. You're escorting one of our own home." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, but the pressure was already building. The eyes of everyone in line were now on the airline staff, and the world, it seemed, was starting to take notice. The man in the military cap folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. "You need to make this right," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "Now." Colonel Thompson remained calm, but inside he was steeling himself for whatever was coming next. The situation had changed. It was no longer just about him. The entire terminal was watching. The agent behind the counter looked flustered, her eyes darting from one person to another. The supervisor looked like he was weighing his options, trying to figure out how to de-escalate the situation. Then the agent turned, her voice suddenly sharper. "You're causing a scene, sir. Please step aside. We'll get this resolved." Colonel Thompson stood his ground. "I won't step aside until this issue is resolved," he replied, his tone unwavering. "I'm escorting the remains of a soldier who gave his life for this country. I won't back down." The supervisor, caught between the pressure of the situation and the attention of the crowd, began to stutter. "Sir, please, we are trying to help." "Help? You're standing in the way of what needs to be done," Colonel Thompson said, his voice unwavering. He looked toward the agent behind the counter, whose face had paled under the scrutiny. The agent nervously shuffled some papers, but no solution was coming. The tension in the terminal continued to rise as more people turned to watch. The old man in the military cap stepped closer. "You've made your point, but you're still not getting anywhere," the older man said, his voice even. "Let's find a way to make this right." Colonel Thompson's jaw clenched, his temper just below the surface, but he held it together. "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here to honor a soldier. Now you'll make sure that happens." The supervisor nodded reluctantly, realizing that this wasn't going to be an easy resolution. "We'll get it figured out, sir," he said, but the doubt in his voice was evident. Just then, a shout rang out from the crowd. "What's going on? Why is this taking so long?" A man at the back of the line had started demanding answers. "Please, everyone, just calm down," the older man in the cap said, raising his hands to quiet the growing unrest. "This will be sorted out. Just give them a moment." Colonel Thompson could feel the weight of the moment. He couldn't back down now, not with so many eyes on him. He took a deep breath and looked back at the agent. "Make it quick," he said, his voice low but firm. "This soldier deserves to go home." The agent hesitated, then nodded and typed something into the system. A long silence followed. The only sound in the terminal, the faint hum of machines and the distant chatter of the crowd. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Colonel Thompson could only watch, his heart racing. He was this close to getting the closure he needed, and yet he knew the battle wasn't over. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the agent turned back to him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and reluctant acknowledgement. "You're cleared to board," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Thompson didn't smile. There was no sense of victory, no triumph. He simply nodded, then turned toward the gate. As he walked away, the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of relief filling the space. Colonel Thompson walked down the corridor with a determined pace, the weight of the moment still pressing on his shoulders. He didn't look back, not once. His mission was clear, and there was no room for hesitation. As he reached the gate, a few passengers glanced up, some giving a polite nod, others unaware of the tension he had just navigated. He was already a figure of respect, but today the respect was earned the hard way. At the gate, the flight attendant looked at him, a brief flicker of recognition in her eyes. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She simply gestured toward the boarding area. "Thank you for your service," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "We're all in this together." Colonel Thompson nodded, appreciating the unspoken understanding. He stepped forward, ready to leave the chaotic noise of the terminal behind him. But as he passed through the gate, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked the message. It was from his daughter. "Dad, I'm so proud of you. I know you're doing the right thing." A brief smile crossed his face as he put the phone back in his pocket. The plane began to board and Colonel Thompson took his seat near the front. He settled in, buckling his seatbelt, his mind still processing everything that had just transpired. As the engines roared to life, he felt a strange sense of peace. The battle wasn't over, but this chapter was, and for now that was enough. The flight was smooth, and the hours passed without incident. Colonel Thompson finally allowed himself to close his eyes, letting the quiet of the sky take over. He was heading home, and it felt like the first time in a long while he could breathe easy. When the plane landed, Colonel Thompson stood, collected his belongings, and moved toward the exit. He had a new mission waiting for him, but for now he was just a man returning home. The terminal was quieter now, less crowded. It seemed like the chaos had dissipated, leaving only the hum of the airport and the whispers of people going about their business. Colonel Thompson walked through the doors, the cool evening air hitting his face. It wasn't just the air that felt refreshing, it was the sense of closure, of a job well done. As he stepped into the parking lot, he saw his car waiting for him, the headlights cutting through the dark. He smiled to himself and walked toward it, knowing that while one chapter had ended, his journey was far from over. Colonel Thompson approached his car, feeling the cool breeze brush against his skin. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before unlocking the door. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at the rearview mirror, his face reflecting a man who had been through more than most could imagine. The drive home was uneventful, the familiar streets of his hometown offering a sense of calm he hadn't realized he'd been craving. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw the lights of his house flickering through the trees. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had slowed down just for him. He stepped out of the car, stretching his legs as he walked up the path. The house was quiet, but he could hear the faint sound of his wife humming in the kitchen. "You're home," she said softly, turning to greet him as he entered. Her eyes held a warmth that soothed the tension still lingering in his chest. Colonel Thompson smiled and took her in his arms. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to simply be, to relax. "How was your day?" she asked, a soft smile tugging at her lips. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "It was a day like no other," he replied, "but it's over now." His wife nodded, understanding more than he said. She didn't press him further, letting him enjoy the peace of the moment. They sat together on the couch, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. Colonel Thompson leaned back, letting the exhaustion of the day catch up with him. "I think I'll sleep well tonight," he muttered, his eyes closing for a moment. "I'm glad you're home," she said softly, reaching out to take his hand. They sat there in the quiet for a while, just being. No words were needed. The peace in their home was enough. Later that night, as Colonel Thompson lay in bed, he reflected on everything that had happened. The mission was over, but his life, their lives, were far from ordinary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tasks, but for now he had what mattered most: family, home, and the peace that came with it. As he drifted off to sleep, the last thought in his mind was one of gratitude. He had done his part. Now it was time to rest.